How did you spend your 4th of July holiday? Grilling? Watching fireworks, maybe? Like Alexander Sandoval of Highland Park, Illinois, maybe you took your family early in the morning to get a good viewing spot for a parade. It's an American tradition, one that turned deadly yesterday. Chaos reigned as a shooter armed with a high-powered rifle fired at random on the parade on the crowd below. And it was then, in that horrific moment, that Alexander Sandoval did something no father should have to do on Independence Day or any other day.
I picked up my kids and we ran again. I put them in a garbage dumpster, and then I ran back to look for my partner and her daughter, and I saw people shot on the ground.
Where'd you have the sense to put your kids in a dumpster?
I don't know, the same sense I had to try to break into a building, like just find a place to hide and to be safe.
He put his kids in a dumpster to save them from the mass shooter on Main Street, America, on the 4th of July. When the shooting stopped, 6 people were dead. 38 others were wounded, many seriously. The suspected gunman, a 22-year-old white local man who left behind a trail of violent online imagery, was apprehended late Monday. An as yet unconfirmed video appeared to show his arrest by police. Did you catch what that officer said? Do me a favor. Get on your knees. I should point out here that that's a far cry from the treatment that police in Ohio last month showed Jayland Walker, a 25-year-old unarmed black man who fled a traffic stop. When the chase ended, 8 police officers fired nearly 100 rounds at Walker, according to photos obtained by NBC's Cleveland affiliate, killing him. The local station also reports a medical examiner observed at least 60 wounds in Walker's body. NBC News has not obtained the autopsy report. How does a 25-year-old black man end up mutilated by police after a traffic stop, while a white suspected mass shooter 2 states over is quietly taken into custody? Nothing is more American than these 2 stories. And they aren't even the whole story. Highland Park wasn't the only city whose Independence Day festivities were marred by violence. There was Philadelphia, too, the cradle of American liberty. In Philly last night, hundreds of onlookers fled the city's July 4th fireworks celebration after, yes, you guessed it, shots were fired. 2 police officers were shot, both treated and released from the hospital. Authorities are still trying to determine exactly what happened, but the mayor of Philadelphia struck a particularly dour tone.
Gun country. It's crazy. We're the most armed country in world history, and we're one of the least safest. I'm concerned every single day. There's not an event or a day where I don't lay on my back and look at the ceiling and worry about stuff. So everything we have in the city over the last 7 years, I worry about. I don't enjoy 4th of July. I don't enjoy the Democratic National Convention. I didn't enjoy the NFL draft. I'm waiting for something bad to happen all the time. So I'll be happy when I'm not here.
This is the world that our current conservative-led Supreme Court wants us to live in. A world in which 400 million American guns have more rights than 300 million American people. A world where elected governments don't get to try and stop gun violence with, laws. Because last month, our unelected conservative justices shot down New York's long-standing gun control law, its gun permit process, saying the Constitution guarantees every American the right to carry guns in public regardless of their need. I know, you may not remember that decision because since then, the highest court in the land has also taken away Americans' constitutionally protected abortion rights and blocked the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases. The Supreme Court, in fact, empowered gun owners in the same week that Joe Biden signed the first bipartisan gun control legislation in decades. A watered-down response to the recent deadly mass shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde that probably wouldn't have stopped either of those 2 shootings or the mass shooting in Highland, where the suspected shooter, as far as we know, didn't have a criminal record and did obtain his gun legally. On Monday, Biden was left mourning the dead in Highland Park and meekly suggesting something more should be done.
6 people have passed and others are wounded, but we got a lot more work to do. We got to get this under control. We got to get this under control.
We know how this story goes. The U.S. has experienced more than 300 mass shootings in 2022, according to the Gun Violence Archive, and we're only halfway through the year. Our gun violence problem is not going away, and the Republican filibuster and the far-right Supreme Court are preventing any real all-encompassing national federal reform. The right, as usual, will say, now isn't the time to talk about reform, to talk about gun control, to talk politically. That's BS. In fact, contrast Biden's message with that of Illinois Democratic Governor J.B. Pritzker.
If you're angry today, I'm here to tell you, be angry. I'm furious. I'm furious that yet more innocent lives were taken by gun violence. I'm furious that their loved ones are forever broken by what took place today.
Well said. In the absence of federal action, Democratic governors like Pritzker and like California's Gavin Newsom are stepping up at the state level, speaking out, showing real anger. But their Republican counterparts in places like Texas and Florida are also stepping up. They're expanding who can carry guns where, with campus carry, with permitless carry, and their laws aren't being struck down by this gun-friendly right-wing Supreme Court. Even as parents are hiding children in dumpsters to keep them from being lacerated by rifle rounds at Independence Day parades. Remember, we spent the past 18 months listening to people, especially on the right, screaming about school closures and kids' mental health and critical race theory and the impact of that on kids. And yet many of those same people don't seem to give a damn about the sheer trauma that gun violence is causing to the youngest, most vulnerable among us. One doctor described the wounded survivors of Highland Park as having experienced, quote, wartime injuries. One eyewitness called the shooting scene a war zone. Ask yourself, what does that experience do to a child in America? Joining me now are Igor Volsky, Executive Director of Guns Down America, and Adam Serwer, staff writer at The Atlantic. Thank you both for joining me. Igor, you're a great guest to have on the show, but I'll be honest, I hate having to book you because you were on this show a few weeks ago discussing the Uvalde mass shooting, and now here we are, me asking you about the latest horrific mass shooting. It never ends.
Yeah, and you've laid out a pretty grim picture, right? Not only is this president showing no interest in actually fighting and actually doing things that he can himself do without Congress, right? Like opening up a White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. He's refused to do that. He's refused to appoint a senior official to actually drive this issue on a daily basis. That's a huge problem. But the other one you point to is the Supreme Court, who, since we last spoke, decided that gun regulations that aren't steeped in some twisted interpretation of history are likely unconstitutional, and that the repercussions of having more guns in our society, of that creating more tragedy in our society, matter far less, in fact, don't matter at all, than what some hypothetical American thought about guns over a short period of time 200 years ago. I mean, that's a huge problem for us moving forward. And so, yes, I hate to be here, too, especially as we now speak, you know, in a situation where things certainly have not gotten better.
Adam, a lot of people on social media on Monday were calling this the most American thing ever, a mass shooting on Independence Day at an Independence Day parade. There's almost a resigned acceptance that mass shootings are inevitable, are as American as apple pie. And that in itself, while understandable, is almost part of the problem, is it not?
Well, I think, you know, the Supreme Court has taken a very selective reading of American history when it comes to guns and gun control. I mean, it is true that notwithstanding the language about a well-regulated militia, we have a long historical tradition of personal gun ownership in the United States. But there is also a long tradition of regulation. I mean, even in the founding era, there were a lot of regulations around guns, specifically in public spaces as well. And the court basically ignored that history. And when it says, the gun regulations have to be rooted in a kind of historical basis, what they're really saying is the historical interpretation that only the selective conservative historical interpretation, not the one that actually is based on historical facts with regard to how guns have been regulated throughout American history, even though we have this tradition of gun ownership.
Yeah, my worry is that too many non-conservatives have accepted the conservative mantra that this is as American as apple pie. This is fundamental to being American, when, as you point out, that's not necessarily the case. Igor, Texas Senator Ted Cruz was tweeting through it yesterday, 2 hours after tweeting that the Second Amendment was, quote, about the fundamental right to defend your life and family. Cruz then said that he and Heidi were praying for the victims of the mass shooting. Again, there's always thoughts and prayers from the right. Isn't it strange, though, that this time round, Igor, there's no discussion from Cruz or from Republicans about the importance of having fewer doors or tougher doors?
Yeah, right. I mean, here the sense is, well, as Adam was saying, right, these things are just going to keep on happening. It's as American as apple pie, and there's absolutely nothing we can do about it. And of course, the answer is that we can, and more specifically, our leaders can, right? And that means setting up a long-term fight for not only, passing the kind of legislation we want to see, but also ensuring that we actually rebalance this court, right? That we reform the way the court is functioning, because clearly we're moving in a very dangerous direction. It's up to our leaders to motivate voters around these fundamental issues of life and death, and which is why, I return back to that image of President Biden standing at the 4th of July celebration in front of the White House and kind of, bemoaning, yes, another tragedy, but laying out no roadmap at all for action. And I'll tell you what. Next Monday, this president is holding a ceremony at the White House where he's inviting survivors, he's inviting advocates, and he's going to hold a ceremony to commemorate the bipartisan legislation that Senators Murphy and Cornyn were able to get through the Senate. That's now law. That's incredibly important and made important progress. But the president has an opportunity to, at that very same ceremony, to say that he is taking more action, that he's going to do what he can, issue more executive orders. He needs a roadmap, a plan that Americans can believe in, not this kind of these tap it, somebody should do something. You have the power, sir. You were elected to take action.
Yes, he does. Adam, Ted Cruz wasn't the only tone-deaf Republican paying lip service to the victims of gun violence. Darren Bailey, a GOP nominee for governor in Illinois, addressed the Highland Park shooting this way during a campaign stop. Have a listen.
The shooter is still at large, so let's pray for justice to prevail. And then let's move on and let's celebrate the independence of this nation.
Adam Bailey has since apologized for diminishing the pain of the victims. He's of course offered prayers for them. But you're the author of the piece, "The Cruelty is the Point." I wonder how cruel it is for millions of Americans to say that the majority of Americans should have to suffer, live in fear and trauma, so that a minority of Americans can buy as many guns as they want.
Well, I think, there is a undeniable aspect to the gun industry that is very disturbing at this moment, which is that part of the way that they have decided to sell these weapons is by implying that someday they will be needed for some kind of political violence. And you can see this in the way that these weapons are talked about. It's not just about defending your home or your family anymore. It's about the day where you're going to have to rise up against tyranny, basically against liberals, and murder your political opponent. And this is essentially a consumer identity that has been constructed in order to sell these weapons that has become essentially a political ideology where you cannot wait to declare that your problems are irresolvable through normal political terms, and therefore violence is justified, and you can act based on wanting to protect your liberty, but what is really in effect a sort of murder fantasy against your political adversaries.
It is very dark and very disturbing. I'm glad you made that point. Igor, on the Today Show on Tuesday morning, Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering talked about the weapon that was used in Monday's shooting. Have a listen.
I don't know where the gun came from, but I do know that it was legally obtained. And I think at some point this nation needs to have a conversation about these weekly events involving the murder of dozens of people with legally obtained guns. If that's what our laws stand for, then I think we need to re-examine the laws.
Igor, a lot of pro-gun conservatives have been pointing out over the last 24 hours that Highland Park has had its own ban on assault weapons since 2013. They're pointing out, they're arguing that this shows that such bans don't work. What is your response to that?
Well, my response is that we know that bans do work, especially when there's a federal floor, federal restrictions on obtaining these kinds of powerful assault weapons, these extended magazines that empower shooters to kill as many people as possible over a very short period of time. By the way, that's true both in the United States and around the world, where we see that tough gun laws have really eliminated the kinds of tragedies we live with on a daily basis. So, you really just have to look at states with tougher gun laws. Illinois is actually one of them that have lower rates of gun homicides, and in our peer nations that don't suffer from these kinds of tragedies.
Yes, indeed. You always have to remember the global aspect. There is no other country in the world that has the kind of mass shootings that the United States has. Adam, one last question to you in this segment. Highland Park's ban on assault weapons is interesting for another reason. It was challenged in court, but the Supreme Court let it stand back in 2015. One SCOTUS watcher told the Times at the time, quote, "The justices certainly aren't eager to take up a Second Amendment case these days. One has to wonder," he said, "if the Supreme Court is having second thoughts about the Second Amendment." Adam, what a difference 7 years and 3 extra conservative appointments to the Supreme Court makes.
Right. I mean, they have a 6-3 court. They can do what they want. They can interpret the Constitution in whatever way they feel like. It doesn't really matter what the history is. It doesn't really matter what the law says. It doesn't really matter what the explicit text of the Constitution is. At this point, the court is a site of political combat, and it's a site of political combat where conservatives have won a resounding victory that is going to have reverberations for years to come. Because with 6 votes, they can afford to lose one uncomfortable justice who thinks maybe this is going a little bit too far. And so I think, when it comes not only to gun restrictions, but when it comes to laws that essentially infringe on other people's rights, forcing them to accept guns in a private space, I think you're going to see this court be pretty aggressive in ways that they were not, even a few years ago.